Adolf Hitler himself and his inner circle were so confident of the Third Reich's swift and unconditional victory that, as early as the beginning of 1941, they began to develop grandiose plans for the future, plans in which Nazi Germany would become the undisputed world hegemon. In fact, Hitler played out his own version of alternative history, not in the past, but in the future, building fantasies about what the world would be like after the Wehrmacht's victory over the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and other enemies. The idea of conquering the territory of the Soviet Union occupied a central place in these plans. It was the East that was seen as key to the implementation of the Nazi doctrine of Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan race. According to Hitler, the German people had become cramped within their pre-war borders, and in order to ensure their prosperity, it was necessary to expand, at the expense of inferior peoples, primarily the Slavs, whom the Führer and his ideologues considered inferior and subject to displacement, enslavement, or destruction. According to the Barbarossa Plan, the war against the USSR was to be completed in record time, by the fall of 1941. It was assumed that the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line would become the eastern border of the new empire, beyond which the remnants of the Red Army would be pushed back, and the territories to the west of it would be finally occupied and integrated into the Reich. The Germans planned to build a powerful defensive system along this line, a kind of eastern wall, which was supposed to protect New Germany from possible partisan attacks and potential attempts at Soviet revenge. Hitler planned to create 4 Reichskommissariats on the conquered Soviet lands: Ostland, the Baltic states and part of Belarus, Ukraine, Muscovy, and the Caucasus. These administrative units were to be governed by German governors and become part of the Great Aryan Imperial Order. It was planned to resettle up to 10 million Germans in these lands and reduce the local population to about 14 million people, whom the Nazis intended to use exclusively as cheap and disenfranchised labor. The rest, tens of millions, faced deportation, starvation, or outright extermination. The remaining Slavs who survived and remained in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union after Hitler's hypothetical victory faced an equally horrific fate. According to the plans of the Nazi leadership, they were to be resettled en masse to Siberia, to harsh, sparsely populated regions where they were to exist as a disenfranchised labor force. Hitler and his ideologues intended to completely deprive the Slavic population not only of political and civil rights, but also of the opportunity to develop as a nation. The complete destruction of their culture, religion, and language was planned. Education for Slavs was to be banned, except at the most basic level, so that they could follow orders but not think for themselves. They would not be allowed to read books, listen to music, engage in art, or even simply study their own history. This was to turn them into obedient slaves of the new Reich. Hitler, as the embodiment of absolute evil, wanted to turn Nazi Germany into a model state, the center of a new Aryan civilization, where order, purity of blood, and iron discipline reigned supreme. The victorious Third Reich was to become a symbol of the ideal future as envisioned by the Führer himself, without crime, without dissent, with a single racial and ideological standard. He sought to create a utopia, but at the cost of the complete extermination of undesirable peoples. In parallel with his eastern expansion, Hitler also had grandiose plans for Western Europe. He planned to divide France between his allies, Italy and Spain, giving them part of the territory as a reward for their participation in the war. Southwestern Europe, on the other hand, was to be transformed into a completely new political entity, the so-called Free State of Burgundy. This state was conceived as a showcase for Nazism, a model of an ideal society where wealth, order, and outward idol would reign. Of course, all this was to be maintained by force, brutal repression, and total control. Many European nations faced forced resettlement. For example, more than half of the Polish population, about 50% of Czechs, and almost 75% of Belarusians were to be deported to Western Siberia, thereby creating permanent enmity and conflict between them and the local Siberians. On the other hand, all Dutch people were to be resettled in eastern Poland as part of a project to Germanize the eastern lands. Germany's allies also received the promised goodies. Finland, as a loyal ally of the Reich, was to be given half of Sweden by the Führer, despite the fact that Sweden remained formally neutral. Other Scandinavian countries faced a different fate. Norway was to lose its independence completely and become a kind of energy colony of the Reich. Thanks to its developed network of hydroelectric power stations, The country was to become the main supplier of cheap electricity for the industry and infrastructure of Northern Europe, working exclusively in the interests of the Nazi Empire. After the final conquest of Europe, Adolf Hitler intended to focus on Britain. He understood that in conditions of complete isolation, deprived of allies and any support on the continent, Great Britain would find itself in an extremely vulnerable position. It would simply have nowhere to retreat. Under such conditions, as Berlin calculated, the British would have to agree to a humiliating peace with the Third Reich and, in the future, under pressure or by agreement, integrate into the new Nazi Europe. However, if Britain continued to resist, Hitler was prepared to take more radical measures. According to the plans of the German command, the British threat was to be eliminated by 1944 through a large-scale landing of German troops on the British Isles. This project, known as Operation Sea Lion, CeeLo, envisaged a simultaneous invasion from the air and sea. In the event of a successful occupation of England, a puppet government loyal to the Nazis was to be established in London. After establishing control over the metropolis, the Reich's next target would be the British colonial possessions in Africa and the Middle East. The Nazis planned to advance through North Africa to the Suez Canal in order to cut off the British Empire's vital transport arteries. The list of conquests included Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and even the western regions of India. In this way, the Third Reich hoped to establish control over Central Asia, ousting both British and Soviet influence from the region, as well as depriving England of its last colonial resources and strongholds. But that was not all. Hitler's strategic plans even included the United States of America, the last major opponent in the global perspective. The leaders of the Third Reich viewed the U.S. as the stronghold of world Jewry and the bulwark of cosmopolitan capitalism, which had to be destroyed. The plan was to crush America on several fronts at once. First and foremost, through a harsh economic blockade. Since almost all the industrial and resource centers of the Old World, as well as a significant part of the world's raw material sources, would be under the control of the Reich, isolating the U.S. would not be so difficult, according to the Nazis. Second, the Third Reich strategic plans included the construction of a powerful fortified military zone in northwestern Africa, in a region that encompasses modern Morocco, Western Sahara, and part of Algeria. It was from there that long-range strikes against the United States were to be launched. This area was to become a base for seaplanes, long-range bombers, and, in the future, intercontinental missiles. It was planned that the east coast of the United States, from New York to Miami, would be within range of German aircraft and missile systems, creating a constant threat to American infrastructure and the morale of the population. Moreover, given that, according to the scenario of victory on the Eastern Front, Germany would have complete control over Siberia, nothing would prevent it from building military bases in the Far East, in areas adjacent to Alaska, Canada, and, in fact, the northwestern United States. Thus, the United States would have been surrounded by potential aggression. From the east, attacks from Africa; from the north, pressure from Alaska; from the west, possible expansion across the Pacific Ocean with the participation of Japan. Thirdly, the Third Reich planned to conclude long-term trade and political agreements with Latin American countries. The idea was to supply the states of South and Central America with weapons, equipment, technology, and political support in exchange for economic and military assistance. Ideally, Latin American countries could be used as a kind of fifth column to be set upon their northern neighbor, the United States. Germany hoped to destabilize the American rear by creating both external and internal threats to the U.S. If the United States did not capitulate under this political, economic, and military pressure, then a more decisive step was planned: the capture of Iceland and the Azores. These territories were to become forward bases and springboards for the preparation of a full-scale landing of European troops on North American territory. The plans were grandiose: the landing of tanks, amphibious units, and aircraft, followed by a further advance into the interior of the continent. Such fantastic, almost insane plans were made by Hitler and his closest associates for a world under the heel of the Third Reich. It would seem that everything was going too easily and one-sidedly for him. The Eastern Front was broken, Britain had surrendered, America was cornered. But, as they say, life is not so simple. Fortunately, history took a different path. Would you like me to tell you how it could have looked in a more realistic scenario? In the meantime, here's a riddle to ponder. What is the significance of the surname Hitler? Don't use Google, just guess. I wonder if you'll get it right. As a starting point, I would still like to take the hypothetical victory of Nazi Germany over the Soviet Union, but let it be not absolute, but rather realistically difficult. Let's imagine that at the end of the summer of 1941, when German tanks were already at the gates of Moscow, they managed to break through to the capital, capture it, and crush the resistance of the Red Army in the European part of the USSR. Demoralized and scattered, Soviet troops began to retreat beyond the Urals, and the Japanese finished off the remnants of their forces, launching an offensive from the east. As a result, the Soviet Union, unable to withstand the blow from two sides, collapsed and effectively ceased to exist, buried in history half a century earlier than in reality. Against this backdrop, Europe, which had secretly hoped for the Soviet Union as a deterrent and possible savior, suddenly finds itself alone against the Nazi machine. Realizing that help from the East would not come, many countries, especially those still fighting or resisting underground, would most likely have been forced to surrender or sign an armistice. Germany would have gained a dominant position on the entire continent, and it would seem that everything was going according to Hitler's plan. However, in practice, things would not have been so smooth. The Third Reich had two formal allies in Europe, Italy and Spain. Both regimes, Mussolini's fascist regime and Franco's regime in Madrid, initially supported Germany, believing that with its help they would be able to expand their influence. But seeing how quickly and without resistance Hitler was subjugating one country after another, the Italians and Spaniards might have had a perfectly logical fear. Would it be their turn next? After all, Hitler was never known for his consistency or loyalty to his allies. He despised weakness and divided peoples into superior and inferior races, and the Romance race did not fit his ideal. In this context, a likely scenario could have been the creation of a secret alliance between Spain and Italy. Amid growing distrust of Berlin, they could have begun secret negotiations with Britain, which by that point would most likely have been forced to sign a peace treaty, but would have been doing everything in its power to get rid of it. And given the close ties between London and Washington, it is quite possible that at this stage the United States, already feeling threatened by the Reich, would decisively enter the war. Thus, a new anti-Hitler coalition, Britain, the US, Spain, and Italy, could begin preparations for a preemptive strike against the Third Reich. The goal would be simple: to prevent the complete enslavement of Europe and not wait for Hitler to strike first. Whether you call it World War II, which has entered a new phase, or a full-fledged World War III, is up to you. But the point is that if, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Germany had not achieved a stable victory but had encountered resistance from its former allies or new coalitions, the center of Europe would once again have become the arena of a large-scale conflict. And one far more destructive than the original World War II. Military technology was advancing, weapons were becoming more powerful, and the ferocity and ideological hatred were only intensifying. In such a situation, it is quite possible that Europe would find itself in a protracted phase of hostilities, comparable to an eternal conflict with no clear winner. Local uprisings, guerrilla warfare, sabotage, secret alliances, and the collapse of coalitions would create an endless, bloody, and exhausting mess. And all this despite the fact that the Third Reich, even weakened by the war with the USSR and other countries, still had a powerful army, industry, and a totalitarian system of government capable of mobilizing resources and people to the last. But let's assume that the Germans were still unable to take Moscow. Didn't they have other options for defeating the Soviet Union, even if not on the battlefield, but by other means? Such options did exist, and they were related not so much to military action as to diplomacy. For example, at the beginning of the Soviet-German War, there is a view that Stalin was indeed ready to agree to a truce with Germany, on terms close to those demanded by the Germans, just to maintain the status quo and gain time to regroup. However, Hitler, caught up in the euphoria of his rapid advance, refused, believing that the USSR was about to collapse. But already in 1942 to 1943, when the initiative began to shift to the Red Army, Hitler, according to rumors, also tried to sound out the ground for a possible truce through intermediaries. However, Stalin was now confident of victory and rejected any proposals. What if there had been a golden mean between these two extreme moments? A turning point when both sides, exhausted but not destroyed, decided to end the war and even, hypothetically, move to a temporary alliance. Imagine, Hitler comes to the conclusion that fighting on two fronts, against Britain and the USSR, is suicide. Stalin, realizing that at the time of a possible treaty, victory over Nazi Germany seemed extremely unlikely, could well have made a strategic decision: better a bad peace than a good war. Such a move would have given the exhausted Red Army a respite and time to recover. Under a hypothetical agreement, Hitler, acting from a position of strength, could have given the USSR territories that were within his sphere of interest even before the war began: Bessarabia, the Baltic states, western Ukraine, and Belarus, as well as possibly parts of Poland. In return, Stalin would receive permission from Hitler and, probably, even assistance in capturing Finland, for the sake of the much-desired access to the Baltic Sea. In return, the Third Reich would demand something substantial. For example, select troops from the Red Army, under the guise of voluntary allies, or, at the very least, the USSR's neutrality in all subsequent conflicts, including the upcoming operation against Great Britain. This could have dramatically changed the balance of power. Germany would have gained a respite on the Eastern Front and the opportunity to focus on conquering Western Europe and the Middle East. Stalin, having strengthened his borders and expanded his territory, would have temporarily retained his influence without entering into a deadly war. A new order would reign on the continent. The balance of power would shift in Berlin's favor. The Third Reich would rule, but it would be flanked by a formally independent but essentially dependent Soviet Union. Europe would find itself under the yoke of a new axis comprising Germany, Italy, Spain, possibly Japan, and nominally the USSR. It is difficult to imagine what such an alliance would have led to. Perhaps Hitler and Stalin would indeed have continued their joint path for the sake of dividing the rest of the world, especially considering that, no matter how much the Führer despised the Slavs, he understood perfectly well that he could not cope with a giant like Britain and its colonies on his own. However, even without an alliance with the USSR, Germany still had some trump cards up its sleeve, and the main one was not political, but scientific. The Germans were actively working on fundamentally new types of weapons. By 1944, V-2, FAU-2, ballistic missiles capable of hitting targets at a range of up to 300 kilometers had appeared on the front lines. It was a weapon of the future, ahead of its time. Had it not been for the Russian pressure from the Allies, the Nazis might have managed to complete other revolutionary projects, from hypersonic missiles and new generation jet fighters to the atomic bomb. The development of nuclear weapons in Germany was in full swing, and according to post-war research, the Nazis were not far from completing the project. In this regard, Nazi Germany really lacked only one thing: time. Just a few more months, and everything could have turned out completely differently. If they had managed to complete the development of the V-2 ballistic missiles, finalize the designs for flying wings and supersonic bombers, and, most importantly, create a working atomic bomb, victory would have been a question not of if, but of when. Europe under Nazi rule, with an arsenal of nuclear weapons and technology ahead of the rest of the world, would have become the epicenter of global terror. With such instruments of intimidation and influence, the entire world would have been under the heel of the Third Reich. Berlin could have threatened any major city on the planet, from Washington to Tokyo. However, despite their apparent omnipotence, it is unlikely that the Nazis would have actually begun to conquer the entire world in the spirit of the Führer's fantasies. In the first stage, they would have had to consolidate their power within the new empire, in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. These were the places where resistance was still strong, where there was still hope that this nightmare would end. But it was in these regions that things would have gotten really interesting. The harsher and more inhumane the regime would have been, the more fiercely the underground war would have flared up. In every country, every city, even every village, resistance. Hidden printing presses, sabotage units, assassinations of Nazi officers, destruction of logistic centers. Graffiti on walls, leaflets, underground radio stations. The slogan, "The Third Reich must fall," would be heard everywhere, from Scandinavia to Algeria, from Warsaw to Kabul. Yes, the Nazis' atomic bomb could have held entire states in check, but it could not have suppressed the spirit of freedom. The fear of total nuclear destruction is nothing compared to the horror of living under a regime where people are sent to camps for the color of their eyes, their surname, or a word they have uttered. That is why the whole world, both those who remained free and those who were enslaved, would have united in silent resistance. The world would have become a partisan. The world would have become a saboteur. The world would have become a shadow following the occupiers, thwarting their plans. Whether this resistance would succeed or not is an open question. But one thing is clear: after a Nazi victory, the world would never be the same again. Every person on the planet would feel the threat hanging over their head, would live in fear, and would wait for the moment to strike this beast in black uniform in the back. Incidentally, a very similar alternative version of the future was shown in the series The Man in the High Castle, where the Third Reich and Japan divided the United States. But even there, hope for freedom did not disappear. So what do you think? How do you like these versions of the future in the event of a German victory? Especially the reality that Hitler himself planned to build? In my opinion, this is the plan of a madman, a real maniac. His ideology is a poison that corrodes all living things. Sadism elevated to the rank of state ideology. It's terrifying to even imagine how different our world would be if the Third Reich had not fallen.